and welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we're going to talk about the Houthi strikes in Saudi Arabia, Italy falling out of the race to the World Cup, and elections approaching in France. Yemen's Houthi rebels have struck vital facilities in Jeddah and the Saudi capital Riyadh. On Friday, a Houthi spokesperson acknowledged attacks on the oil giant Aramco in Jeddah and other cities. The F1 race is taking place on Sunday at Saudi at a site in Jeddah, less than 10 kilometers from the strikes. Prashant from People's Dispatch is with us to share some more details. Prashant, could you tell us a little more about these strikes?
Right, Pragya. So two important aspects. One is, of course, that there's yet another strike by the Houthis at an Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia. We know that one similar strike took place last Sunday. There was an attack in November 2020 in Jeddah. Before that, drone strikes at two very important facilities, I believe, in 2019 as well. So Saudi Aramco has always been a key, in some ways, a target for the Houthis because I think perfectly exemplifies the kind of assault that the Houthis can do and damage Houthis can cause to Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia, as we know, is a kind of country which is highly dependent on its oil exports, on its oil production. That is basically the lifeline of Saudi Arabia. And the fact that any attack on some of these facilities leads to a massive doubt about Saudi Arabia. Even the damage is not very high, it leads to a massive doubt about Saudi Arabia's ability to actually deliver and produce this oil. So, which is why I think Saudi Aramco has always been a key target. And the other fact, of course, is the thing that the Houthis are now also beginning to choose their timing, in a very delicate manner. So, for instance, we know that, like you said, the Formula 1 race going to take place on Sunday, a very important race, of course, and it's a global event, a lot of eyes on that event. So, at this point of time, striking Saudi Arabia obviously, sends a much more important message than what the actual damage that these strikes cause, because that's probably quite negligible. If you look similarly, the last time the Houthis struck the UAE, it was when Israel's president was visiting as well. Again, the amount of damage caused is not so much the issue as much as the symbolic element. So, while the Houthis in Yemen are massively outnumbered in terms of technology and other resources, they've nonetheless they've fought the Saudi-led alliance, which is, all these major powers. They've fought them to a standstill. They've taken over a lot of these areas. And I think time and again, the Houthis have, made it a point to sort of emphasize that this is not just a war restricted to Yemen. Because what the Saudis and the Emiratis want, for instance, is to keep this war hidden in some senses. So the Houthis also striking back, I think, to prove that point as well, that this is not just a case of you coming and bombing our country and then going back without consequences. So I think they're more than the military significance of these, which is always important, because the fact that they've been able to get these attacks through is also a sign of the fact that the Saudis can't stop them. That's one aspect. But also there's a very strong symbolic element to what the Houthis are doing, especially considering the conflict has been dragging on for 7 years, 377,000 people killed, millions on the verge of famine. So, but nonetheless, Yemen has been a largely forgotten war. So I think this is one of the key aspects of the Houthi strategy.
Is there also a sort of realignment of forces on each side, which is leading to these kind of attacks?
So that's a very interesting dynamic in recent times. We do know that we talked about this on the show before, that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been following a slightly different policy from have not been as close to the US line on the Ukraine war. On the other hand, one of the key reasons they're not entirely in sync with the US is because they want tougher action against the Houthis on Yemen. So their deal seems to be that, give us a carte blanche, a free check it through whatever we want in Yemen, listen to our demands on Yemen, and we'll give you the oil you want. Seems to be that seems to be speculation that is going around regarding that. So the Houthis also concerned about this issue, that in return for oil, the Saudis and the Emiratis might get a blank check, so to speak. And if you look at recent times, there's been an improvement. The Saudi-led alliance has had some breakthroughs in certain provinces. The Houthis have suffered a bit of retreat, fighting going on in Marib nonetheless. So all this put together, a very complicated situation in Yemen right now. It's very unclear which way the pendulum will turn. All it might take is a couple of breakthroughs. So while there's a global realignment going on, definitely yes, but the people of Yemen are not going to benefit probably from that realignment. For instance, there is the fact that Iran and the Saudis and the other powers, there's a bit more of engagement taking place there. But while the Iranians are believed to be allies of the Houthis, it's unlikely that this might spill over into Yemen and benefit the people of Yemen. So very complicated picture, multiple dimensions over here. But the key issue here is the war has, the Houthis wanting to make sure that this is the issue of Yemen is not buried in this at all. So I think in time we'll see probably more of these symbolic attacks unless there is a very concerted effort to have talks and discussions. There have been multiple rounds before; they've not had a breakthrough. So I think and now we know that after this attack that took place yesterday, the Saudis have launched an offensive as well. So it's a kind of cycle of violence that we're seeing. So until there is a concerted initiative by the Saudi-led alliance to sort of step back and say that we'll talk, until they're open to the possibility of Yemen's political future being dealt with by all these parties, it's a very bleak scenario for the people.
All right, Prashant, thanks a lot for that. 8 months after winning the European Championship trophy and being feted as national heroes, Italy's soccer team have crash-landed, missing out on the World Cup finals for the second time in a row. Siddhant Ane is here with more.
Quite simply, Pragya, because a couple of things apply to, I think, all sport, at least from our perspective. One is anyone but England. And the other, it's always great when an underdog comes from really out of nowhere and shocks a team that is considered to be a giant in that sport. Italy have won the World Cup, if I'm not wrong, 4 times in the past, including back in 2006. They are, like you said, current European champions and playing a side from North Macedonia that really doesn't have any celebrated players, any global superstars. So for those of us who watch from a neutral perspective, it's always great to see these underdog stories. In Italy, of course, now it's a couple of days of national mourning. Friends who I spoke to pretty much refused to even respond to text messages and calls. I was hoping to have an Italian journalist in this spot talking about what's happening in Italy. But they're pretty much like Roberto Mancini, the current coach who's likely to depart after this debacle. Like he said, I really don't know what to say about the future. So I think that's the general sentiment in the country, which is also preoccupied by what all of the challenges that Europe is facing at the moment. So maybe football not on the top of their minds, but still very much an important subject. And like the morning newspapers all had headlines reflecting the same.
Okay.
Pretty sort of anguished reaction from the country.
Okay, so Siddhant, would this, however, be the last time that a major football playing country in Europe gets to stay out of the final?
Quite possibly, Pragya, because FIFA has decided from 2026 to expand the World Cup finals for men to a 48-nation, 48-team tournament. Europe will get an additional, I think, 4 spots, so 3 spots actually, going up to 16 total countries from Europe that will participate, making it all the more likely for big countries like Italy to be there all the time. I think one of the ideas behind the expansion is to make sure that all the big ticket games happen, because FIFA looks at the World Cup, it is the only event that FIFA has that makes profits. The Women's World Cup is now slowly starting to catch up, but the Men's World Cup is really the golden goose. So the point of the expansion, while it's been touted as increasing the participation of African countries and Asian countries, yes, it's happening to some extent, but there are also plenty of countries in these two. Fact is, in terms of sheer numbers, Europe will still dominate the field in that sense, and bigger nations will have a sort of more clear path to the finals. But for Italian football, it's a time of, I think it should be a time of reflection, because all of this stems from, it's not just about the national team. If this is a sport that is so popular in the country, it requires some introspection into what's happening in the club system, because clubs from Italy, which have traditionally done well in Europe in club competitions, in the last few years in the Champions League, for example, they've not made it past the quarterfinal stage. None of the Juventus and the Milans and all these big teams haven't been able to make a mark. So there's clearly something going on in Italian football that is a broader issue. And some of the smaller nations in Europe are kind of closing some of those gaps. So interesting to see how things are developing.
Okay, maybe once the day of mourning ends.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Siddhant. In April, close to 50 million French voters will choose who will govern the nation for the next 5 years. A dramatic and extremely volatile contest is on. The war in Ukraine, climate issues, livelihood and economic concerns, and a rabid campaign by right-wing candidates are all playing a part. Prashant spoke earlier to Aurélie Dinara, a researcher and political activist from France, on the context of this election.
Well, so as you said, there will be two rounds. So the French people will be called to vote on the presidential election on the 10th of April, and then on the second round on the 24th of April, I think. And they will be called to decide whether to reappoint the current president, Emmanuel Macron, who's a center-right president, or to choose an alternative between the 11 other candidates that are present in this election. And this election is taking place, obviously, in a context marked by the Ukrainian war, as you can imagine, but also in a context that is still marked by the COVID crisis, and also by a very deep social and ecological crisis in France. I think it's important to understand basically what are the issues before the voters in this presidential election, to mention that the past 5 years, so the years of Macron's presidential term, have been really characterized by an important impoverishment of the lower classes and the working classes in France, and by increasing inequalities. The French government has been accelerating a process of neoliberalization of French policies that already started something like 40 years ago. They have been sort of implementing a project of bottom-up redistribution of sort of social and fiscal counter-revolution, if you want. Basically, cuts in the public budget, cuts in public services, and dismantling of the social state, while at the same time giving money to flow to big firms and the richest people in France. And there's another point to mention about this sort of the current issues and the current landscape, which is the inaction of the French state during the 5 previous years regarding the ecological crisis. In fact, the French state has been convicted several times in the past few years by French courts for climate inaction. And so this is basically what's the landscape that French people have to deal with right now. The result of these policies of the French government are, as I said, growing inequalities and an impoverishment of the population, and a very important climate emergency. So we have basically more and more reports and surveys of different NGOs and associations that keep telling us every year how the richest people in France are getting richer and richer. To give you just a few examples, the 5 richest billionaires in France now own as much as 27 million of the poorest people in France. This is, I think, very significant. It has been growing worse in the past years. We have a situation now where 12 million people in France are unable to heat their homes properly. 8 million people depend on food assistance. 4 million people are poorly housed in France. There are 300,000 people who are roofless, and something like 6 million people registered to the unemployment, to the job center in France, and probably even more than that is the number of people who are actually jobless. The billions or the hundreds of billions of euros that have been spent since the COVID crisis by the French government went mostly to big firms and the richest people in France. And aside from this economic and social sort of emergency, there is also this very bad climate emergency. In France, the summers have been getting more hot every year. We have been having more floods and fires every year. And the last, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report of this IPCC shows that the consequences of global warming are going to be devastating for human populations among the world, including in France. And yet, what's going on now in these weeks just before the election, as in the past few years, actually, is that these ecological and social issues are almost completely eclipsed from the public and political debate, the media debate, which are very much centered on questions like immigration, Islam, and supposed insecurity in France. So yes, basically I would say that the French voters will have to decide basically in April when they go voting between another 5 years of neoliberal and authoritarian policies with one of the candidates of the right, or a different road towards wealth redistribution and climate action if they choose to go with the left.
And that is all we have today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back tomorrow. Please visit www.peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.